They told her to trade her dignity for water, and no one in Red Hollow said a word. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, stay with me, because this one rides quieter than most. The sun hung low over the dust-choked street, turning every window into a sheet of fire, and Clara Whitmore stood there with her 2 children behind her, their small hands clutching the hem of her worn dress, their lips dry, cracked like the earth beneath their feet. 3 weeks without steady water had carved something hollow into their faces, something no mother could ignore. Not out here where mercy cost more than gold. Barrow leaned against the well's wooden frame, hat tipped low, a man who knew exactly how much power a bucket of water could hold, and the townsfolk gathered in loose silence, boots shifting, eyes drifting anywhere but the woman in front of them. One night, Barrow said, not loud, not soft, just certain. And your children drink for a month. And the words didn't echo, they settled, heavy, like dust on skin. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked down at the 2 boys, one no older than 8, the other barely 5, their eyes too tired to cry. And something inside her tightened, not fear, not shame, something older, something that had carried women through worse than this. Across the street, half hidden in the shade of a saloon porch, Ethan Cole watched without moving, his chair tilted back. Against the wall, boots crossed, a man known for owning more land than anyone for 50 miles, a man who could have ended the moment with a single word, but he didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't even reach for the glass beside him. The wind moved through town like a whisper, carrying the smell of dry wood and distant cattle, and still no one stepped forward, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not the men who had once tipped their hats to Clara when her husband was alive. Barrow waited, patient, as a man who never lost, and finally Clara nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if the decision had been made long before this day ever came. A murmur rippled through the crowd, low and uneasy, but it died just as quickly as it started, because no one wanted to own it. No one wanted to be the first to say this was wrong. Ethan Cole's eyes didn't leave her, not for a second, but his face gave nothing away, no anger, no approval, just stillness, the kind that made men wonder what was turning beneath it. Clara stepped forward, her boots leaving faint prints in the dust, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked in his direction, not pleading, not accusing, just seeing, and whatever she saw there made her turn away without a word. The door to Barrow's house opened with a slow creak, wood dry against its hinges, and as it closed behind her, the town exhaled like it had been holding its breath all along. Somewhere, a horse shifted, leather creaked, a child coughed, life went on, as if nothing had just been traded in plain sight. And still, Ethan Cole did not move, not when the sun dipped lower, not when the shadows stretched long across the street, not even when the first lantern flickered to life in Barrow's window. He just sat there, watching the light, as if waiting for something no one else could see. The lantern in Barrow's window burned late into the night, a steady glow that pulled eyes even when men pretended not to look. And across the street, Ethan Cole finally set his chair flat on the ground, slow, deliberate, like a man who had come to the end of waiting. He stepped off the porch without a word, boots pressing into the dust that still held the heat of the day, and the few men left outside the saloon watched him go, not speaking, because something in the way he moved told them this was not a walk meant to be followed. The night air carried a dry chill now, the kind that settled into bones after sunset on open land, and somewhere a loose shutter tapped against a wall in a tired rhythm. Ethan passed the well without glancing at it, though every man in town knew that well had become the center of something rotten, something no one had been brave enough to name. Inside Barrow's house the light flickered once, then steadied, and Ethan stopped just short of the door, not reaching for it, not knocking, just standing there long enough for anyone watching to wonder if he would turn back like the rest of them always did. But he did not turn. Instead, he looked up at the sky, dark and wide, the kind of sky that reminded a man how small he really was. And then he stepped away, leaving the door untouched, leaving the light burning behind him. By the time the first pale line of morning stretched across the horizon, Ethan was already riding, his horse cutting through the open land beyond Red Hollow, hooves striking dry ground in a steady, unhurried rhythm. heading toward the county office 20 miles out where paper and ink carried more weight than any gun ever could. The clerk there knew him by name, knew better than to ask questions when Ethan Cole placed a stack of documents on the desk and spoke in that quiet voice that never needed to rise. And by noon, signatures were made, seals pressed into wax, and ownership shifted without a single raised voice. Back in town, Barrow stood at the well like always, greeting the morning with the same easy confidence, until a rider came fast down the road, dust trailing behind like a warning, and handed him an envelope that felt heavier than paper should. He opened it with a frown that slowly turned into something tighter, something less certain, his eyes moving across lines of ink that did not bend to his will the way people did. One by one, the townsfolk began to notice the change. The way Barrow's shoulders no longer sat as high, the way his gaze flickered instead of held, and no one spoke. Not yet, because they were waiting, just like Ethan had waited, for something to reveal itself fully. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that stretched from the well to every corner of Red Hollow, a quiet understanding began to settle over the town, the kind that did not need to be said out loud, only felt, like the first drop of water after a long, unforgiving drought. The first bucket hit the bottom of the well with a hollow sound that echoed farther than it should have, and when the rope came back up, there was no water, only dry wood scraping against stone, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. Barrow tried again, hands tighter this time, jaw set, as if effort alone could change what had already been decided miles away. But the second pull came up just as empty, and a murmur spread through the small crowd gathering around him, low and uncertain, like wind before a shift. "That is not possible," he said, though no one had asked, his voice lacking the edge it carried the day before, and he unfolded the paper again, reading it slower now, each word landing harder, each line stripping something from him that could not be taken back. The well, the land beneath it, the rights to every drop that passed through that ground, all signed over, sealed, recorded, not in anger, not in haste, but in a quiet transaction that left no room for argument. Across the street, Clara Whitmore stepped into the morning light, her children close behind her, and there was something different in the way the town looked at her now, not bold enough to meet her eyes, not brave enough to apologize, just aware in a way they had not been before. She moved slowly, as if testing the ground beneath her feet, as if the world might still shift under her, and when she reached the well, she stopped, not touching it, not asking, just standing there while Barrow folded the paper with hands that no longer seemed steady. A man near the back cleared his throat, then another shifted his weight, and one by one they stepped aside without being told, creating space where there had been none the day before. Because something had changed, something none of them could undo. The sound of hooves carried in from the edge of town, unhurried, familiar, and Ethan Cole rode in like he had never left, dust trailing behind him in a thin line that caught the morning sun. He did not look at Barrow first, did not address the crowd. He let the silence stretch until it settled into every corner of Red Hollow. Then he dismounted and walked to the well, his boots steady, his expression unreadable. He reached down, took hold of the rope, and lowered the bucket. Himself, slow, controlled, the wood sliding down into the dark, and when he pulled it back up, water followed, clear and full, catching the light in a way that made more than one person blink. He set the bucket on the edge and stepped back, not claiming it, not announcing anything, just leaving it there like something that had always belonged to the people who needed it most. Clara looked at him then, really looked, and whatever she expected to find in his face was not there. No pride, no pity, just a quiet certainty that did not ask for thanks. Behind her, one of the boys stepped forward first, small hands reaching for the bucket, and no one stopped him, not Barrow, not the men who had stood silent the day before, because there was nothing left to stop him with. And as the child drank, slow at first, then deeper, the town watched without a word, understanding settling in like the dust, that some men do not fight the wrong in front of everyone. They wait, they take it apart piece by piece, until there is nothing left of it at all. No one spoke when Barrow stepped back from the well, not because they feared him anymore, but because there was nothing left in him worth fearing, and that silence followed him as he moved through the crowd. a man who had once owned every drop, now unable to claim even a glance. Ethan Cole did not watch him leave, his attention already somewhere else, somewhere quieter, as if the matter had been settled long before anyone else understood it. The bucket remained at the edge, full and waiting, and soon more hands reached for it, careful at first, then steadier, men filling canteens, women lifting pails, children stepping closer than they ever had before, and with each draw of water the weight in the town shifted, something loosening, something returning that had been missing longer than they cared to admit. Clara Whitmore stayed where she was for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on her youngest son's shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, slower now, easier, and when she finally turned away from the well, it was not with urgency, but with a quiet strength that had not been there the day before. She walked past Ethan without stopping, not out of distance, but because there was nothing that needed to be said between them, and he did not call after her, did not offer words that would only make something simple feel heavy. Instead, he moved to the side, giving space the way a man does when he understands that dignity is not something you hand to another, it is something you allow them to keep. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill, and Red Hollow began to sound different. The creak of wagons, the low murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of water hitting metal pails, all of it weaving together into something that felt almost like life again. A few men lingered near the saloon, glancing between Ethan and the well, their faces carrying questions they did not yet know how to ask, and one of them finally stepped forward, hat in hand, as if approaching a line he had never crossed before. "You could have stopped it last night," he said, not accusing, not quite understanding, and Ethan looked at him then, not hard, not soft, just clear, the way a man looks when he has already weighed the answer. "No," he replied, his voice even. "I could have interrupted it," and he let that settle. Let the difference sit where it needed to be, because there were some lessons a town had to feel, not hear. The man nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because something in the truth of it made arguing feel smaller than silence. By afternoon, word had spread beyond the edges of town, riders carrying it out across the dry land, the story changing shape as it traveled, but always circling back to the same quiet center, that the well no longer belonged to one man, that the water had been given back without a fight, and that the one who had done it never raised his voice. And as the light began to soften again, stretching long across the ground, Ethan Cole returned to the porch of the saloon, set his chair against the wall, and sat down just as he had the day before. But this time the town did not look away. This time they understood that sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is wait, and sometimes the strongest thing he can give is something he takes back without anyone seeing it happen. By evening, the wind carried a different kind of sound through Red Hollow, not the dry whisper of dust alone, but the steady rhythm of water being drawn again and again, and with it came something the town had not felt in a long while, a quiet kind of relief that did not need to be spoken out loud. Clara Whitmore stood by her small cabin at the edge of town, watching her boys laugh for the first time in weeks as they spilled a little water onto the ground without fear of wasting it. And she did not stop them, not this time, because some things were meant to be felt before they were measured. The last light of the day stretched across the plains, painting everything in gold, and for a moment the world looked softer than it truly was. But Clara knew better than to trust appearances. She had seen how quickly things could turn when power sat in the wrong hands. A shadow moved along the fence line, slow and familiar, and when she turned, Ethan Cole stood there just beyond the gate, not stepping in, not calling out, simply waiting the way he always seemed to, as if time itself answered to him rather than the other way around. Her boys noticed him. First, their laughter fading into quiet curiosity, and the older one gave a small nod, not out of fear, but something closer to respect, the kind that comes when a child understands more than words can explain. Clara walked toward the gate, stopping a few feet short, the space between them filled with everything that had happened and everything that had not been said. "You changed everything," she said, her voice steady, not soft, not accusing, just true, and Ethan shook his head once, a small motion that carried more weight than denial. "No," he answered, "I just put it back where it belonged." and he let the words settle the same way he let everything settle, without forcing them to land. Clara studied him for a moment longer, searching for something she could hold on to, some sign that would explain the silence, the waiting, the choice to act when it mattered most. But all she found was that same stillness, the kind that did not ask to be understood. Behind her, one of the boys called her name, holding up a tin cup filled to the brim, proud of something so simple it almost hurt to look at, and she turned back to him with a faint smile, the kind that grows slowly after being gone too long. When she looked again, Ethan had already stepped back, not retreating, not lingering, just leaving the moment where it belonged, untouched. The night came on steady and calm, and across the town, lanterns lit one by one, each small flame reflecting in the water that now moved freely through every hand that needed it. And though no one gathered to celebrate, no speeches were made, no thanks were offered, something deeper took root in the quiet spaces between them all, because out here, where the land was harsh and memory longer than any road, people did not forget who had stood still when it mattered, and who had chosen to act without asking for anything in return. And as the stars settled over Red Hollow, clear and endless, the town understood something it would carry long after the dust shifted again, that real change does not arrive with noise or force. It arrives like water in a dry place, steady, necessary, and impossible to ignore. Once it is there, the next morning did not arrive with surprise. It came steady, like a promise that had already been made, and Red Hollow woke to the sound of water moving again, not in fear, not in whispers, but in open daylight where everyone could see it. The well no longer felt like a place of bargaining. It felt like what it should have been all along, a shared breath in a dry land. And men who once stood with their arms crossed now stood with buckets in their hands, quieter, slower, as if learning something they had ignored for too long. Clara Whitmore stepped out into the early light, the sky pale and wide above her. And for the first time in weeks, she did not measure the day by what might run out. She measured it by what remained, and that was enough. Her boys ran ahead toward the well, not rushing out of fear, but with the careless steps of children who believed things would still be there when they returned. And that belief alone changed the way they moved. Across the street, Ethan Cole was already awake, seated once more in that same chair, the wood worn beneath him, his hat low, his eyes following nothing in particular and everything at once. A man who had already done what he came to do. A rider approached from the northern trail, dust rising behind him in a thin, urgent line. And though most in town barely noticed, Ethan did, his gaze lifting just slightly, enough to catch the shift before it arrived. The rider pulled up hard near the well, breath quick, eyes scanning, and he carried news the way men carry storms, unsure who it would fall on first. "Barrow is not done," he said to no one and everyone, voice tight with the weight of it. "He is riding for men who do not care about papers or stamps." And the words moved through the town like a shadow, subtle at first, then longer, stretching into places that had just begun to feel safe. Clara heard it from a distance, her hand tightening around the small tin cup she carried, and though she did not step back, something in her shoulders remembered the shape of fear. The boys slowed, their laughter fading into watchful silence. Because even children know when the air changes. All eyes turned, not to the rider, not to the road, but to Ethan Cole, the same man who had said nothing before, the same man who had acted when no one expected it. And he did not rise right away, did not rush, did not answer the tension with more of it. Instead, he stood slowly, brushing the dust from his coat, and walked toward the well with the same calm step he always carried, as if whatever was coming had already been accounted for. He stopped beside Clara, not looking at her, not speaking to her, but close enough that the space between them felt deliberate, like a line drawn without being seen. "Water stays," he said finally, his voice low, not loud enough to carry far, but strong enough that those nearest heard it and passed it on without thinking. And something in the way he said it made the words feel less like a promise and more like a fact. The rider frowned, uncertain. The town held its breath again, but this time it felt different, not like helpless waiting, but like standing behind something solid. Something that did not need to move to hold its ground. And as the sun rose higher, burning away the last of the morning haze, Red Hollow did not scatter, did not retreat. It stayed, because, for the first time, the silence in that town did not belong to fear. It belonged to a man who had already shown what quiet could do. The heat settled heavier by midday, pressing down on Red Hollow like a hand that did not intend to lift, and still no one left the well, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because something in them refused to step back again, not after what had already been taken and returned. The rider's warning lingered in the air, carried from one whisper to the next, shaping itself into something larger with each telling. Men who did not care about law, men who answered to coin and nothing else. The kind who turned disputes into silence and called it order. Clara Whitmore stood with her boys close now, one hand resting against the older child's shoulder, the other holding the tin cup as if it were something more than metal, something earned twice over. Across from her, Ethan Cole remained exactly where he had been, beside the well, not guarding it, not claiming it, simply existing in that space with a stillness that made others feel steadier without knowing why. The town watched him, without meaning to, waiting for a signal that never came. And slowly they began to understand that there would be no signal, no command, only a choice each man would have to make on his own. A few drifted closer, not in a crowd, but in quiet steps, a ranch hand with dust still on his boots, an older woman with hands worn from years of work, a shopkeeper who had once looked away and now did not. And they stood near the well, not speaking, just present. The sound of hooves reached them before the riders appeared, a low, steady rhythm rolling in from the far edge of the road. And when they came into view, they did not rush, they did not shout. They rode like men who expected to be obeyed simply by arriving. Barrow was among them, seated straighter than before, his confidence patched together by the presence of others, his eyes scanning the town as if searching for the weakness he once held so easily. The riders slowed as they entered, taking in the sight before them, not a scattering of fearful faces, but a town that had chosen to stand where it was. Ethan did not step forward to meet them, did not raise a hand, did not change the distance between himself and the well, and that distance became the measure of everything that followed. Barrow spoke first, his voice louder than it needed to be, filling space that no longer belonged to him. But the words did not carry the same weight. They landed and faded, because no one moved to answer them. A man beside Clara shifted his stance, not away, but firmer. Another set his bucket down, slowly, as if preparing for something without knowing what it would be. And even the children held still, their eyes moving between the riders and the man who had said so little and changed so much. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, and then something quiet broke through it. Not a command, not a challenge, just the simple sound of ropes sliding against wood as someone lowered the bucket into the well again. It was not Ethan who did it. Not this time. It was the ranch hand who had stepped closer earlier, his movements steady despite the eyes on him. And when he pulled the bucket back up, full and shining, he did not hesitate. He handed it to the next person in line as if nothing stood in his way. The riders watched, uncertain now, because there was nothing to confront, nothing to push against, only a town that had decided, without saying it, that some things were no longer for sale. Ethan's gaze moved once across the line of people, then back to the riders, calm, unchanged, and in that stillness was something harder than defiance, something that did not rise or fall with the moment. It simply remained. And as the sun burned overhead, Red Hollow held its ground not with noise or force, but with the quiet understanding that the man who had taken everything from Barrow had not done it for himself, and that meant no one here would give it back. Barrow's men did not dismount, not at first. They sat high in their saddles as if height alone could return what had already slipped from their hands, their horses shifting under them, restless in the still air, and yet something in the scene before them did not match what they had ridden in expecting. There was no shouting, no scattering, no fear to push against. Only a line of ordinary people drawing water in plain daylight as if no one had the right to stop them anymore. Barrow's jaw tightened, his gaze moving from face to face, searching for hesitation, for the old weakness that once lived in this town. But it was not there the way it had been before. It had thinned, changed shape, turned into something quieter but far more difficult to break. Ethan Cole remained beside the well, not blocking it, not claiming it, simply present in a way that made every movement around him feel deliberate. And when one of the riders shifted forward slightly, testing the space, Ethan did not react. He did not reach. He did not even turn his body, but his stillness held like a line drawn across the ground that no one stepped over. Clara Whitmore felt it too, the difference in the air, the way her boys stood a little closer but did not hide, the way the people around her did not drift away but stayed, each small decision building into something larger than any one of them. A long moment passed, stretched thin between two outcomes that no one wanted to name. And then one of the older riders glanced at Barrow, not with certainty, but with a question, the kind that comes when confidence begins to slip. Barrow opened his mouth, ready to speak again, ready to reclaim control with volume, if not with right. But the words did not land the way he intended. They fell flat against a town that had already chosen not to. Listen, somewhere behind him, a horse stamped against the dry ground, impatient, and the sound echoed louder than it should have, breaking the illusion of authority that had carried them this far. The ranch hand at the well finished filling another bucket and handed it off without pause, and another stepped forward, and another, the rhythm unbroken, steady as breathing, and with each pass of water, the distance between what Barrow once was and what he had become grew clearer. Ethan finally moved, not forward, not toward them, but slightly to the side, enough to reveal the well fully, as if to say there was nothing hidden here, nothing to contest, nothing left to take. His eyes met Barrow's then, not sharp, not challenging, just steady, and in that look was something that did not rise to meet anger. It simply outlasted it. The riders shifted again, less certain now, their formation loosening in small, almost invisible ways, and one by one, they began to turn their horses, not in retreat exactly, but in the quiet acknowledgement that there was nothing here to be gained without becoming something they did not want to be. Barrow lingered a second longer than the rest, his gaze fixed on the well, on the water that no longer answered to him. And then he too turned, pulling his reins with a sharp motion that carried more frustration than command. The dust rose behind them as they rode out the way they had come, but it did not carry the same weight. It drifted lighter, thinner, like something already fading. Red Hollow did not cheer, did not move, did not break the quiet that had held them through it all, because they understood now that what had just happened did not need noise to prove itself. It needed only to be seen. And as the last of the riders disappeared beyond the bend in the road, the rope slid once more into the well, the bucket dropped, and when it came back up full again, the sound of water against metal felt like something earned, something kept, something no one here would ever again pretend they did not see. The town did not move for a long while after the dust settled, as if Red Hollow itself needed time to understand what had just passed through it. And then slowly, almost carefully, life returned to motion, not rushed, not loud, but steady, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The line at the well did not break. It grew, not out of desperation this time, but out of trust, something that had been missing longer than anyone cared to admit, and each person who stepped forward did so without looking over their shoulder. Clara Whitmore filled another tin cup and handed it to her youngest, watching the way he drank without fear, without hesitation, and for a moment her eyes closed, not in exhaustion, but in something softer, something that had not had space to exist until now. When she opened them again, she saw Ethan Cole walking away from the well, not toward the center of town, not toward any place that would mark him as the cause of what had changed, but toward the edge, where the land opened wide and quiet, the way it always had. He did not look back, and that, more than anything, settled something deep inside her, because it told her this had never been about being seen. A few of the townsfolk watched him go, their expressions thoughtful, uncertain, as if trying to understand a language they had only just begun to hear, and one by one, they returned to their work, carrying with them the weight of what they had allowed before, and what they had chosen now. Near the well, the ranch hand who had first stepped forward wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced around, not for approval, but as if measuring the space he now stood in, and finding it different, stronger, because he had stood his ground in it. An older man approached him, slow, deliberate, and gave a small nod. No words, just recognition, and that nod carried more than any speech could have. Clara turned back toward her cabin with her boys beside her, their steps lighter, their voices returning in quiet bursts of laughter that felt almost fragile, as if they might disappear if held too tightly. The door to her home creaked open, the same as it always had, but inside, the air felt different, less heavy, less uncertain, and she set the bucket down carefully, watching the water settle, clear and still, reflecting the dim light that filtered through the window. Outside, the sound of hooves had faded completely, leaving only the wind and the soft rhythm of the well. And somewhere in that quiet, the town began to understand that what had happened was not a single act, not a moment that could be pointed to and named, but a shift, something that had moved beneath their feet and would not move back. Ethan Cole reached the far edge of Red Hollow and paused there, looking out over the dry land that stretched for miles, unchanged, unforgiving, and yet different in the way it met his gaze, as if it too recognized that something had been set right without force, without noise. He adjusted his hat slightly, a small motion, almost absent, and then continued on, his figure growing smaller against the wide horizon. Back in town, Clara stood in the doorway of her cabin for a long moment, watching the same horizon, though she could no longer see him. And in that space between what had been lost and what had been returned, she understood something that did not need to be spoken, that some men do not stay to be thanked. They leave behind something far greater, a choice. A line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. And as the sun dipped lower, again, casting long shadows across Red Hollow, the town held onto that line, not out of obligation, but because now, finally, they knew what it meant to stand on it. The evening settled over Red Hollow with a softness that felt earned, not given, the kind that comes after something has been tested and held, and the well stood at the center of it all, no longer a place of power, but a place of balance, where every bucket drawn carried the quiet weight of what had changed. Clara Whitmore sat just outside her cabin, her boys asleep inside, their breathing steady through the open window, and she held a cup of water in her hands longer than necessary, watching the surface catch the last light of the day, as if reminding herself that it was real, that it would still be there tomorrow. Across town, men spoke in lower tones than before, not out of fear, but out of reflection, the kind that follows when a line has been crossed and cannot be unseen. And though no one named it directly, each of them carried a piece of responsibility for what had nearly been lost. The ranch hand who had first stepped forward stood by the well again, not guarding it, not claiming it, just present, the same way Ethan Cole had been. And in that quiet imitation, something passed from one man to another without needing to be taught. The saloon doors creaked open and closed as they always had, but even there, the laughter was different, less sharp, less careless, as if the town itself had grown aware of its own voice. Far beyond the edge of Red Hollow, where the land stretched open and dry under a sky too wide to measure, Ethan rode alone, his figure small against the horizon, and there was no urgency in his pace, no need to look back, because what he had done was not something that required watching over. The trail beneath him carried the same dust it always had, the same long miles between one place and the next, and yet the weight on him seemed lighter, not because the world had changed, but because something in it had been set back where it belonged. Back in town, Clara rose slowly and stepped inside, setting the cup beside the small table near her boys, and for a moment she stood there, listening, not to the wind, not to the distant sounds of the well, but to the absence of fear that had once filled every quiet space. She moved to the doorway again, looking out toward the fading light, and though she could no longer see the man who had stood in silence while everything unfolded, she understood now that silence had never meant absence. It had been the beginning of something far greater. The stars appeared one by one, steady and indifferent above the town, and beneath them, Red Hollow settled into a night that felt different from all the nights before it, not because it was safer, but because it was clearer. No one gathered to mark the change. No one spoke of justice or right or wrong, but it lived there all the same, in the way people moved, in the way they looked at one another, in the way they no longer turned away, and somewhere out on the open land, a lone rider continued on without leaving a trail anyone could follow, because what he left behind was not meant to be chased. It was meant to be carried, quiet and steady, like water in a dry place, like a truth that does not need to be spoken to be known. The next day did not announce itself with anything grand. It arrived the same way it always had, pale light stretching over dry land, wind brushing against wood and dust. But Red Hollow woke differently, not because something new had been added, but because something old had been removed, something that had weighed on every quiet moment without being named. Clara Whitmore stepped outside with her boys trailing behind her, their steps lighter now, their voices no longer careful, and she noticed how they no longer looked to her before moving forward, how they trusted the day to hold. The well already had a small line, not crowded, not tense, just people moving through a shared rhythm, taking what they needed and leaving space for the next, and there was no one standing over it, no figure claiming more than another, only the simple act repeated again and again. The ranch hand stood nearby, not in charge, not in command, but present in the same quiet way Ethan Cole had once been, and others mirrored it without realizing, a shift so subtle it felt like it had always been there. Clara filled her bucket and paused, watching the water settle, the surface clear enough to reflect her face, and for the first time in a long while, she did not look away from it. Across town, a few men repaired a broken fence that had been ignored for weeks, their movements steady, their conversation low, not about what had happened, but shaped by it all the same. And even the saloon carried a different tone, the laughter softer, the pauses longer, as if every word now carried a measure of awareness. Near the edge of town, a child stumbled while carrying a small pail, water spilling onto the ground, and instead of sharp words or frustration, a man stepped forward, took the handle gently, and helped him steady it. A simple act that passed without comment but did not go unnoticed. Clara saw it, and something in her chest loosened, not relief alone, but recognition. The understanding that what had changed was not the well, not the water, but the way people chose to stand when it mattered. The wind moved through the open land beyond Red Hollow, carrying no sign of riders returning, no shadow of what had threatened to take hold again, only distance and quiet, and somewhere far beyond sight, a lone figure continued on, without leaving a mark anyone could follow. Clara turned back toward her cabin, her boys running ahead, their laughter unbroken this time, and she followed at her own pace, not rushing, not holding back, just moving forward the way the town had begun to. Inside, she set the bucket down and listened for a moment, not to the outside world, but to the stillness within her home, a stillness that no longer felt empty. When she stepped back outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting clean light across every corner of Red Hollow, leaving little room for shadows to hide in, and in that light, people met each other's eyes more often, not out of obligation, but because they no longer had reason to turn away. No one spoke of what had been done, no one named the man who had set it in motion, but his absence carried as much weight as his presence had, a reminder that not all change comes with a face to thank. And as the day stretched on, simple and steady, the town held to something new without needing to hold it tightly, because now they understood that what had been given back to them was not just water, but the quiet choice to stand differently, and once made, that choice did not fade with the light. The days that followed did not rush. They unfolded slowly, like something learning to trust its own weight, and Red Hollow carried on without needing to speak of what had changed, because it showed itself in small ways that could not be mistaken. Clara Whitmore noticed it first in the mornings, when the line at the well formed without tension, when people stepped forward and stepped back without watching each other too closely, as if the space between them no longer needed guarding. Her boys had begun to wander a little farther from the cabin, not recklessly, but freely, their voices echoing across the dry ground in a way that no longer felt fragile, and each time she heard them laugh, it settled something deeper than relief. Near the well, the same ranch hand still lingered, but now he was not alone. Others stood nearby at different hours, not by arrangement, not by duty, but by choice. And together they formed something unspoken, a quiet understanding that what had been restored would not be surrendered again. The town itself seemed to breathe differently, doors left open a little longer, conversations carried without lowering voices, and even the wind felt less like a warning and more like a companion moving through familiar ground. Clara passed the saloon one afternoon, and saw men inside pause in their talk when a young boy entered to deliver a message, not out of irritation, but out of awareness, making space without needing to be told. And she realized then that the change had gone deeper than the well. It had settled into how people saw one another. Out beyond the last row of cabins, the land remained the same, wide and unyielding, stretching for miles without promise. But even there, something felt different, not in the earth itself, but in the way the town now faced it, no longer bent by what it might take, but steadied by what they had chosen to hold. Clara returned home that evening with a bucket of water balanced easily at her side, her steps unhurried, her thoughts no longer circling around what could be lost. And when she set it down inside, the sound of it touching the floor felt final in a way she had not known before, as if the fear that once followed every drop had been left behind somewhere she would not return to. She stepped back outside and looked toward the horizon, not searching for anyone, not expecting anything, just taking in the quiet line where sky met land. And though the figure who had set all of this in motion was long gone, his absence no longer felt like something missing. It felt like something complete. The town behind her moved on in its steady rhythm, people crossing paths, sharing small gestures, holding to something they had not been able to name before, but now understood without needing to. And as the sun lowered again, casting long shadows that no longer hid anything worth fearing, Red Hollow stood in that light with a kind of quiet certainty, not because they believed nothing would ever threaten them again, but because they had seen what it meant to stand differently when it did, and that knowledge did not fade. It remained, like water drawn from deep ground, clear, steady, and carried forward in every choice they made from that day on. Time moved on the way it always does out on the frontier, not fast, not slow, just steady, and Red Hollow carried its days with a quiet kind of weight that no longer bent under it, the well standing at the center like it always had. But now it meant something different, something no man could own again. Clara Whitmore stood there one late afternoon, her boys beside her. Taller now in the way children grow when they are no longer afraid, and she watched as a young girl she barely knew lowered the bucket with careful hands, her father standing back, not guiding, not correcting, just trusting her to do it right. The rope slid, the wood creaked, and when the bucket came back up full, the girl smiled, not because it was a victory, but because it was normal, and that was something Red Hollow had nearly forgotten how to be. Clara filled her own pail and stepped aside, her eyes drifting across the town, seeing things she would not have noticed before. A man helping another fix a broken hinge without being asked, a woman sharing bread on a porch without counting what it cost. Small things, easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once you knew what they meant. No one spoke about that day anymore, not out of fear, but because it had settled into something deeper than memory, something that lived in the way people chose to stand when no one was watching. Sometimes, when the light hit the well just right, Clara thought about the man who had stood in silence while everything seemed lost, and she understood now that silence had not been absence. It had been patience, the kind that waits until the right moment to change everything without breaking anything at all. She never saw him again, not in town, not on the distant roads, but every so often, a traveler would pass through and mention a rider who kept to himself, a man who paid his debts in full and asked nothing back, and Clara would listen without asking questions, because she already knew what mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, her oldest boy asked her why no one ever tried to take the water again, and she looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the child he was, but the man he might become, and she knelt slightly, so her voice met his at eye level. "Because we remember," she said, not loud, not soft, just certain, and the boy nodded, not fully understanding, but holding on to it the way children hold on to truths they will grow into. The wind moved across the open land beyond the town, carrying dust and distance and everything the world had yet to bring. But Red Hollow no longer felt like something waiting to be taken. It felt like something that could stand. And as the last light faded and the first stars appeared, the well stood quiet under the sky, a simple circle of wood and stone, nothing more, nothing less. And yet it held a story no one needed to tell, a story written in silence, in choices, in the way people no longer turned away. Out here, justice did not arrive with thunder or fire. It did not need witnesses or words. It came the way water comes to dry ground, steady, patient, and once it arrived, it stayed, not because someone forced it to, but because people chose, every single day, to keep it there.